begin this morning with tens of thousands of United Auto Workers hitting the picket lines. The union officially went on strike against Detroit's big three automakers at midnight.
On September 15th, 2023, the International Union, United Automobile, Aerospace, and Agricultural Implement Workers of America Automotive Division, or more commonly known as the UAW, or United Auto Workers, started their first ever trilateral strike against the big three automotive makers in Detroit, Michigan: Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. The first phase of the strike began with 13,000 workers walking off the job at three of the most profitable plants, one for each automaker. This strategy was a part of the new stand-up strike strategy put in place by President Shawn Fain of the UAW. This new strategy saw workers continue to walk off the job as time went on, forcing automakers to continue to give additional concessions, or the UAW would continue to further harm profitability and revenue. The strike ended up lasting for over a month until eventually the UAW and the automakers signed what was considered to be a historic new contract. It is estimated that between the lost revenue from the idled plants and the additional costs from the new UAW contract, that this strike cost the automakers billions of dollars. Given the importance of positive labor relations, especially in a production-intensive industry such as the automotive industry, it is important to investigate how negotiations deteriorated to the point of mass strikes costing billions. The future already appears grim for the big three automakers, with current UAW President Shawn Fain already preparing workers for an even larger strike when the new contract expires in 2028, stating, "We have to pay for our sins of the past." Back in 1980, when Reagan at the time fired Patco workers, everybody in this country should have stood up and walked the hell out. We missed the opportunity then, but we're not going to miss it in 2028. That's the plan. We want a general strike. We want everybody walking out, just like they do in other countries. With the massive disruption already plaguing the auto industry, with electrification and consolidation looming, people are asking, what happened in the past to cause such a deterioration in the relationship between the UAW and the big three? Why did the UAW feel so empowered to negotiate using a distributive style and hardball tactics and flex the power that they had now? And what needs to happen moving forward to ensure the future success not only of the UAW, but of the big three automakers and of the American auto industry as a whole? We'll be exploring all of this and more in this edition of Common Sense Today. Hi, and welcome to Common Sense Today. My name is Mitchell Giuliano, and I will be your host. Today's edition, we're going to be discussing the 2023 UAW strike against the big three and all of the implications around the negotiations and business world that had, as well as how it might impact the future. For those of you that haven't been with us before, welcome. And to explain a little bit more about how we do this, we're going to break the issue up into its key sections, and each section is going to be recorded in one take with all of the imperfections and miscues that come along with that purposefully, so that way we can give you the most authentic experience possible and really share with you a real take on the issue and explain to you clearly without any cuts or devious tricks exactly what happened. So with that, let's take it away. So the first piece of the UAW 2023 strike that we need to take a look at is the relationship between the UAW and big three automakers, currently now Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. Stellantis includes the Chrysler brand, which was the original member of the big three, but then through acquisitions has now eventually become a member of the larger conglomerate known as Stellantis that also contains several other brands. However, an important aspect of the 2023 UAW strike that we hadn't necessarily seen before was the culmination of several factors that led to an extensive breakdown of the relationship between the UAW and the big three. And to understand that relationship, what we have to do is understand the history first, and then understand how we got to this point. So just a brief history, the UAW was founded originally in 1935. They started off by unionizing GM, followed then by Chrysler, and then by Ford a couple years later. And the UAW's beginnings weren't as simple necessarily as other unions at the time. The AFL was the primary organizing body for unions, and the AFL was pretty opposed to unionizing factory workers. So from the get-go, the UAW really had to fight for the right to unionize. And that's always seemed to put quite a chip on the UAW's shoulder, and also consequently has made the UAW one of the most influential and important unions in the entire United States, with the ability to heavily impact not just Michigan's economy, where they're primarily located, but also the entire US's economy. The UAW and the automakers had a tense relationship, as did most business owners and unions during those early decades, simply through the virtue of there were no worker protections at the time. Most worker protections were fought for and earned by the unions through striking, and so the UAW had to scratch and claw and fight for its influence. We get to World War II. Obviously, during World War II, a lot of patriotism. Unions pretty much suspend all striking, and the country goes into war mode as they enter into World War II. And so we don't see a lot of action with the unions. However, once we get out of the war and we start getting into the 1960s and then especially the 1970s, we see union influence and membership take off. We see unions expanding their influence heavily. And we saw the UAW membership balloon to, I believe it was about 1.5 million members during that time period, which is the highest number of members that they had in their entire history, including up until now. While there was that type of success, there was some failure. The UAW was unable to unionize the various foreign auto manufacturer factories that are present here in the United States. While some of these foreign automakers did agree to have some negotiations with minority unions within their factories, overall that push was largely unsuccessful. And so the UAW relationship continued to be solely defined by the UAW's relationship with the big three automakers of Ford, GM, and at the time Chrysler. Which is really easy to instead seeing a relationship between the UAW and Ford, and then the UAW and GM, and then the UAW and Chrysler. It makes it really easy to then see it instead as the UAW versus the big three. You can group the big three into kind of one entity for all intents and purposes. And that's kind of how the negotiations during the time between the UAW and the big three took place, right? The UAW would choose a target corporation, whether it be GM, Ford, or Chrysler, to primarily base their negotiations on. They would negotiate with that company. If the company wasn't playing ball, then the UAW would threaten to strike that company. If the UAW did strike, they did it with the purpose of allowing the other two companies of the big three to cannibalize sales from the struck company as they failed to meet production needs. And then that would eventually pressure that member of the big three to come to an agreement with the UAW. And then the other two companies would follow suit with almost exactly structured agreements, right? So if the UAW chose GM as a target, they would go negotiate with GM. If GM didn't play ball, they would strike GM. UAW and GM come to an agreement, and then Chrysler and Ford sign agreements with the UAW that are largely modeled off of the GM agreement. It served two purposes. It allowed the UAW to only have to fund striking out of their strike fund for one company, which is a much smaller population of their members. And then on top of it, it allowed the big three to all remain on even footing when it came to cost structure. Now, the presence of the UAW in their factories didn't help their cost structure when it came to competition against foreign automakers that weren't unionized. Some estimates over the years have put the cost advantages of foreign auto manufacturers at around $10 to $20 an hour per worker compared to the unionized big three. But it kept the big three on an even playing field, which is better for them, more than they could ask for in a reasonable arrangement. After the 1970s, 1980s, we see union membership start to a slow decline. And once we hit the 2000s, the unions and the big three are kind of on cruise control. Negotiations are occurring. There's not much in the way of striking because agreements are being made. The negotiations basically take place between high-level members of the big three and then union leadership behind closed doors. They come to an agreement, present it to the membership, and then the membership the leadership says this is the best agreement we can get, and membership votes on it and usually would accept the agreement. We then get to the 2007-2008 financial recession. And this is extremely detrimental time for the big three automakers. Out of the big three automakers, two of them nearly failed. They would have failed if it hadn't been for assistance provided by the US government. GM required a cash infusion through the purchasing of stock, and Chrysler also had to declare bankruptcy and required a cash infusion from the US government, and then was also at the same time forced to merge with the also in crisis Italian automaker Fiat to form Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, so then the two governments could share the cost burden of saving those automakers. Part of the reason the US government did that is because of the significant impact that the auto industry has on the US economy and the Michigan economy. They employ thousands and thousands of people across the country, and losing those jobs would have been a significant amount of damage to the economy, on top of the significant loss we would have had to our manufacturing capabilities, which are necessary for national security and various other reasons, of course. Getting a little off topic, but in the end, it was extremely necessary to save these two companies. And while the federal government did step in to save those two companies and offer assistance to Ford, who in the end didn't necessarily need it, it wasn't necessarily enough to just have the federal government helping. The big three also went to the UAW to request concessions. Obviously, the declaration of bankruptcy by Chrysler and GM passed along the message to the UAW that this was an extremely serious request, that if the UAW didn't come to the table with some sort of concession, that the automakers were going to fail. They didn't have the ability to support the cost structure anymore that had been built up over the previous decades with all of the additional benefits, the introduction of a pension, the increase in wages. the big three just couldn't afford those cost structures anymore. So they go to the UAW and ask the UAW for some help, and the UAW agrees. Some of the concessions they agree to make is they eliminate pensions and replace it with a 401k for new employees with a auto contribution from the companies. So that way the companies don't have to carry that cost burden anymore. It's just a singular investment by the companies. Another concession that the UAW made is in two-tier pay. So if you worked for one of the big three in their factories prior to the recession, you were paid at one level. And then if you started working for the big three after the recession, you started out at a much lower pay. And then over the years, as you worked for those companies, you would slowly build up to a higher pay. Membership obviously didn't like these concessions. Nobody likes having to give up benefits that they've already won. And given the stress of the financial recession, they likely enjoyed those concessions even less, but also have to be somewhat thankful for still having a job. And union leadership at the time understood the necessity to help save and bail out the big three. So after the financial recession, the companies continue to rebuild, regain market share, rebuild sales and revenue. And as we get into the late 2010s, we start to see increasing profits and improving sales. So the companies become healthy again. All three of them continue, especially as fuel prices reduce and the market for SUVs and light duty pickup trucks, which all of the big three heavily specialize in compared to other automakers around the world. As that market starts to heat up, they start to earn more revenue as well. The problem was in the mid to late 2010s is the UAW benefits didn't necessarily accelerate at the same pace. You didn't see an elimination of two-tier. You didn't see a reinstatement of pensions. You saw what some would define as minimalistic wage increases. And so you get to a point where membership of the UAW is largely frustrated and doesn't understand the actions that their leaders are taking. We come to find out that part of the reason for this is because of massive amounts of corruption within UAW leadership. There was a large corruption investigation launched in 2014, with details slowly starting to come out starting in 2017. And there's multiple elements to the corruption that was eventually uncovered, but the two key parts of it were over a dozen members of UAW leadership, including former presidents, were indicted and convicted of criminal charges because they embezzled millions of dollars in membership dues and out of a shared training center with the big three funds, out of those funds. And then on top of it, they also were accused of and convicted of bribery charges because it turns out that Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, formerly known as just Chrysler, had been bribing UAW leadership to get better terms in their contracts. And there were three former FCA executives that were also convicted in the bribery scheme. FCA was fined, I believe it was $30 million, and then put on probation for a few years, where there was heavy monitoring of the of FCA's labor practices. So that heavily damaged UAW membership confidence in their leadership, in their relationship with the big three, and basically turned what had been a cruise control relationship. You get to the recession and become a very communal cooperative relationship where the UAW agrees to help the big three out and basically save their companies, to now turns out that the big three have been taking advantage of the UAW largely throughout the mid to late 2010s. There had been bribery, and UAW leadership had been embezzling from their own fellow members. So all of this built up and begs the question, why didn't this all blow up then in 2019, 2020? Well, the quick answer is COVID-19, the coronavirus. Pandemic starts in March of 2020. The entire world basically shuts down. Everyone goes into lockdown. You have large amounts of hospitalizations and deaths taking place, and the companies have to go into partial shutdown. Again, another crisis. The UAW again agrees with two modifications of their labor contracts, which includes partial shutdowns in the factories, right? So the UAW gets guaranteed hours in factories running, but because of COVID-19, obviously you're not allowed to be in person based on government regulations. So they agree to, partial factory shutdowns and shutting down certain factories entirely and then rotating those shutdowns. The only reason the factories were even running at all is because the automakers shifted their manufacturing to building ventilators for hospitals as well as other PPE equipment, et cetera. So, during that crisis, there wasn't a time for action to take place between the UAW and the big three. As we near 2021 and we slowly start coming out of the pandemic, right? Obviously, it's a very slow ramp up to come out. And given everything had shut down and nobody had left their house, the expectation is a recession would take place. However, world governments, thinking they'd learned their lesson from 2008, felt that they needed to provide stimulus to the economy to prevent a recession and provide that stimulus quicker and in a much heavier amount. And so global governments infused the global economy throughout the pandemic, and especially as we're coming out of the pandemic in 2021, with trillions of dollars in stimulus. So instead of us seeing a significant drop in demand and then a subsequent recession due to everyone being at home and people having to conserve their financial resources and all of that, we instead see booming demand and extremely higher prices because supply chains have become constrained. So basic economics, supply becomes constrained, demand goes up, you see increasing prices, and scarcity and shortages take place. And the automakers, once they're allowed to resume production and resume selling cars, are able to take full advantage of it, right? You basically stopped car production for at least a year. And what that did to the supply, especially because it also slowed down everything else down the very complex supply chain that you have, is you harm the used car market because you had cars that failed over COVID that weren't then replaced by new cars being sold. And then you have also extremely tight constraints on the new car market because obviously you have a bunch of people that are now in the market for a new vehicle and not enough vehicles to sell them. So the automakers are able to take on heavy price advantages. They're able to increase their margins substantially. And all three of the big three have record years for profit and revenues and income when we hit 2022 and 2023. However, accompanied by that is no change in the benefits or pay given to the UAW. Of course, the UAW is receiving part of that extremely high performance by the big three in the form of profit sharing. However, they're not actually seeing any other benefits. This isn't totally unforeseen because obviously they have a contract in place, but at the same time, the UAW, having gone through 2008 and bailed the big three out, and then corruption in the late 2010s, and then having agreed to concessions to get through the COVID-19 crisis, arrives at a point where the UAW is feeling extremely spurned, and as though that the big three don't appreciate their relationship anymore. And when we hit 2022, the UAW finally starts to see significant changes taking place from the corruption that had been previously uncovered. So you see changes occurring within the very structure of the UAW that allows for a much higher amount and higher level of member control. The most significant change is the change in how leadership is elected and selected within the UAW. Previously, it was a delegate convention where delegates were sent from local unions up to UAW headquarters, and then the delegates would choose the UAW president and leadership. And that process had largely been filled with favoritism and providing favors to people in exchange for votes in order to choose the president. It was a very elitist style selection process. Coming out of the corruption scandal, though, the UAW is now required to do a one member, one vote direct election of their leaders. So for the first time in UAW history, the UAW president was elected by a direct vote of their members. And while this election was foreseen, the results of the election weren't necessarily expected, right? So you have your incumbent president, Mr. Curry. He's of the old guard type style of UAW leadership. And then you have a few different challengers. And the biggest challenger that he ended up coming across was Shawn Fain, who had been a UAW member for 28 years. He had held posts within union headquarters staff. But the most important part is that he was backed by a dissident group within the UAW called Unite All Workers for Democracy, which had raised tens of thousands of dollars to help fund his election campaign to become UAW president, with the goal of basically completely refreshing all of UAW leadership and completely refreshing the entirety of the way that the UAW operated in the past. Shawn Fain wins and is elected UAW president, and then we arrive to 2023. So at this point, the relationship between the Big Three and the UAW was extremely tense and broken down. They had gone from largely operating as an elitist system behind closed doors on cruise control, enjoying regular approvals and support from UAW membership in general, and having a pretty favorable relationship to facing corruption, a UAW membership base that feels spurned and unappreciated, and a new UAW president that had been elected for the very sole purpose of shaking things up and completely changing the way things operate in the past. This is all even further complicated by the presence of new external pressures that they hadn't faced in the past. As I mentioned previously, the UAW and the Big Three had always faced pressures from foreign automakers because the UAW wasn't able to unionize foreign automakers. So there was always an external pressure on the Big Three that the foreign automakers are almost guaranteed to have a lower cost structure for labor, and some pressure on the UAW where foreign automakers would oftentimes provide some minimalistic pay and benefit increases if the UAW was able to win it from the Big Three. But those pressures always existed and existed for decades, and both sides kind of knew how to manage it. The larger issue and the external pressure that they are facing from a third party now is from the federal government. And this more largely impacted the UAW than the Big Three, although it had an impact on both. And that is with the huge push against emissions and transition from internal combustion engine vehicles over to electric vehicles. Obviously, there is a significant amount of investment that's going to be necessary for this. All of the Big Three have pledged billions of dollars in investment in order to transition their entire model lineups from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles over the course of a couple decades. And there's a lot of pressure to reduce emissions in their fleets now as well. The reason this is scary for the UAW is because electric vehicles are a lot less complex to build. And so as a result, require fewer workers and a simpler supply chain. which directly is in conflict with what the UAW wants, which is to keep all of their UAW workers employed, have jobs for other people to come in and join the UAW and grow UAW membership and continue to have a lot of influence. The sense of isolation from all of their previous relationships that the UAW was feeling at the time is further compounded by the fact that the primary political party that is driving this push towards electric vehicles is the Democratic Party, which has traditionally been the supporter of labor movements, right? The Republican Party has tended to be the party of business owners, and the Democratic Party has tended to be the party of unions and labor movement. And so with the Democratic Party pushing heavily on this electric vehicle front and forcing the automakers to push to what is going to be a simpler to build vehicle that requires a lot less labor and support from unions, the UAW feel increasingly isolated and spurned, not just now by the big three, but also by their longtime traditional supporters in government. This is showcased by the fact that the UAW withheld their endorsement for President Joe Biden's reelection for so long. And when Joe Biden came to Detroit to visit the UAW picket lines, it was an extremely brief and tense visit. And there was a lot of speculation around why that was, but the reason is pretty obvious. It's because the Democratic Party and President Joe Biden are trying to walk an extremely thin line where they push for clean vehicles while also trying to still kind of and make friends with the big three, by the way, to try and continue to convince them that going down the electric vehicle path is the correct thing to do, while also at the same time still trying to keep their relationship with the labor movement and the high levels of support that they have historically received from that sector. And so all of these things culminate together with the UAW feeling extremely isolated, with most of their relationships completely breaking down. No ability for the UAW to really form coalitions with any of their old partners, and just not really knowing what to do at that point. And you always know the traditional saying of, the scariest person or position to put a person or an animal is to back them into a corner, because then you never know what they're going to do. And that's basically what happened here with the UAW. And so, the place that we're at is a spurned and isolated UAW with broken relationships all over the place. And so the next thing that we need to take a look at is, now that we know where the UAW sits, how is it that they had the confidence to act in the extremely brazen and untraditional manner that they did? So at this point, we've obviously set the stage for what is going to become a pretty significant showdown between the big three and the UAW. But isolation in and of itself isn't enough to explain the brazen and hardball style tactics that the UAW ended up using in their 2023 strike. Something other than just the deteriorating relationships and isolation of the UAW had to contribute to the confidence that they felt and the tactics that they used. And the reason behind why the UAW was so confident and felt that they had an upper hand in this was the shifting dynamics of power between themselves and the big three. When we take a look at the years following the COVID-19 pandemic, we see a story of extreme shortages in the labor market. First of all, due to increased demand driving pressure on the supply chain that had been shut down and therefore was dealing with shortages and scarcity. And so companies were in a rush to hire as many people as they could as possible to catch up to demand, which led to labor shortages in the market. However, the even bigger piece of it is the fact that there was pressure on workers to demand more from their employers because following the COVID-19 pandemic, the demand side pressures and supply side pressures led to extremely high periods of extremely high inflation. Take a look at 2022, we saw an average annual inflation of around 7%. 2023, the average annual inflation was around 6.5%. And when where the US had experienced relatively low levels of inflation of 2% or less for years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, workers had never had to experience the pressures put on their household finances that are brought about by inflation. So when you combine the high pressures of inflation with the relatively low wage increases and benefit increases that the UAW had seen in recent years, as was explained in the previous section, you can begin to understand how that isolation that the UAW felt didn't just stay isolation, but also started to transform into desperation as you saw the workers of the UAW start to feel the strain and financial stress brought about by the new economy after the COVID-19 pandemic. A second piece to the shifting in the power dynamics between the big three and the UAW had to do with the culture and atmosphere around striking and unions in general in the United States. When you look at corporations and their relationships with unions, the power balance and dynamic between the two of them tends to shift over time. At times, when it's difficult to find other jobs, you'll see corporations start to take on more power as they gather resource power, and they're the ones who tend to have more control in the negotiations. But in 2023, that wasn't the case in the United States. The culture was very much so around union strength and worker strength. And we see that through other union actions that took place throughout the year. You had Starbucks strikes going on. You had the Writers Guild of America go on strike in Hollywood. You had the Los Angeles teachers strike. And you also had the actors go on strike through SAG-AFTRA in Hollywood. And so these high-profile strikes really encourage other large unions to consider striking. But the most influential action that took place in 2023 around encouraging the UAW to make extremely high demands and keep on the pressure until the big three relented and gave into their high demands was the new contract that the Teamsters signed with UPS. So the Teamsters contract expired in 2023 as well, and the Teamsters threatened to go on strike against UPS unless they agreed to extremely high demands for theirs. And in the end, the Teamsters contract led to the final version has the average pay and benefits of a UPS driver set at $170,000 a year, increased hourly pay for part-time workers as well, up to $21 an hour. Saw additional working protections included with vehicle air conditioning in all new vehicles and cargo ventilation in all new UPS delivery trucks. Recognized Martin Luther King Jr. as a full holiday for the first time and also eliminated forced overtime. So it was described as the Teamsters as the most lucrative contract and most highly supported contract among their membership in Teamsters history. And being, with the history and influence of the Teamsters Union and having been around as long as the UAW and being similarly large and fighting similar battles as the UAW looked at that contract and saw it as a message telling them that this was their opportunity to go on the offensive and push hard to get the best increases that they possibly could. Their entire mindset sort of shifted from the years, the decades leading up to this, where the UAW had to be concessionary and give up benefits for the big three to survive. And because the labor market was never as tight as it had been in the years following the COVID-19 pandemic, the Great Recession led to mass unemployment. The UAW had never really found itself in the sort of position that they were, where they could make these types of high-level demands and use the style of hardball tactics that they did throughout the negotiations. So while the big three might still have had the resource power and the legitimacy power, and their tightening of their relationship with the federal government increased the big three's network power, because they now had connections within the Democratic Party, which had traditionally supported the labor movement. And all of that isolating the UAW, it didn't really end up mattering in the end, because they were made desperate and they had large amounts of power through culture, and the culture that surrounded unions in 2023 that ultimately led to them having the ability to make significant demands and use significantly tougher tactics. And we'll see how that all impacted their final negotiations as we walk through what actually happened during the negotiations and what's going to be necessary for them and the big three to come out of this in the future and have them all survive. As of March 2023, the stage had basically been set. You had your newly elected UAW president, Shawn Fain, in place at the UAW. They had grown desperate, and over the upcoming summer would continue to be motivated by the improving culture around the union movements taking place in the United States. And unfortunately, while we have explored all of the different ways that the big three could have seen coming the high demands and hardball tactics that the UAW is going to use, in real time, the big three didn't see it. While contracts were set to expire September 14th, negotiations did not really begin in earnest until July 14th. Now, while in the past, this might have been typical, this round of negotiations and this strike were handled completely differently from years past. They were handled out in the open. As we mentioned earlier, in the past, union negotiations with the big three tended to take place behind closed doors with elitists, but Shawn Fain was very open. In March 2023, he told workers that he was going to negotiate for their contracts, and he was fed up with the status quo. May 2023, he told them that he was going to ensure that he won back everything that they had lost in the 2007-2008 Great Recession. Throughout all of his speeches, he began using the phrase of record profits mean record contracts. And so Shawn Fain was prepping for battle, and the big three were not ready for it. So note that some of these details about the strikes come from both external and internal resources that we have here. And so when we talked to them and we explore what happened with the strike, the big three ended up receiving a list of demands with hundreds of line items for them to address from the unions when contract negotiations started, which the big three, apparently the negotiators on the big three teams were completely unprepared for. And their subsequent list of demands were maybe a quarter to a fifth of what the union delivered to them. And as they began to work through the list of demands, the union or the UAW representatives were extremely resistant and hesitant to making concessions. There was no meet in the middle attitude. There was no, we're in this together, let's move forward together. It was, we want all of it. And those details did eventually get, were released to the public. Shawn Fain shared with the UAW exactly what he demanded from the automakers in their first offer, at least the highlights, and the highlights being an increase in wages of up to 46% over the length of the contract. It would have been broken up into an initial wage increase of 20% and then yearly wage increases that eventually totaled up to 46%. It demanded a restoration of traditional pension payment plans and retiree healthcare benefits. It demanded a 4-day work week, which is a never before heard of demand from any workforce in the entire United States. It included additional job guarantees and protections for workers already employed, as well as staffing levels. It also demanded the ability to automatically unionize electric vehicle factories, and on and on and on and on. Those are the big highlights, but there was a significant list of demands presented to the big three that they were completely unprepared for. Additionally, the big three seemed to not understand the type of negotiation they were in and the attitude that the UAW was approaching this with. One great example is during the initial phases of the negotiations, Mark Stewart, who was the chief operating officer of Stellantis, head of North America, and basically the highest level executive that was involved in the UAW negotiations for the Stellantis side, in one of the initial meetings that he had with the UAW representatives and UAW president Shawn Fain, he took it as a video call over Teams chat from his vacation home in Mexico. Obviously, this extremely upset Shawn Fain and the UAW representatives, and their reaction was in a way to the point where Mark Stewart never did that again and showed up to every other time he showed up after that was in person. So when we get to mid-August and there had been little to no progress made on the negotiations, you saw a vote take place in the UAW, which was overwhelmingly approved at 97% voting in favor to begin going on strike. But again, the big three were caught unprepared because Shawn Fain decided to utilize a new tactic that he called a stand-up strike, or what you could refer to as a rolling strike, where he started by strategically striking different factories and plants at each of the big three. He started with one per. So he struck the Michigan assembly plant in Wayne, Michigan for Ford, the Toledo complex for Stellantis, and the Wentzville assembly plant for General Motors, which is about 13,000 workers overall. And they walked off the jobs. And the premise was, if your negotiations did not make sufficient progress to satisfy the UAW negotiators and President Shawn Fain, he would then increase the number of strike actions against those companies over time. So an example of that occurred pretty quickly after September 14th was on September 22nd, he announced strikes expanding to the 38 part distribution plants operated by Stellantis and GM because they hadn't made enough progress in their negotiations towards agreeing to demands of the UAW, or at least getting to a point where the UAW felt that they were agreeable concessions. So they didn't end up striking Ford in that particular phase of the stand-up strike because they claimed that they had made some real progress with Ford. But then later on, you would see on October 11th, the UAW adding Ford's Kentucky Truck Assembly Plant, which is their most profitable production facility in the entire company, where all 8,700 of those workers ended up walking off the job and joining the strike because Ford didn't make enough progress in their talks. So it was a brand new tactic. And again, the big three were caught completely off guard. So the UAW was unprepared for the attitude of the strikes. The big three were unprepared for the scope of the strikes, where all three were struck at the same time. The big three were unprepared for the number of demands coming from the strike. The big three were unprepared for the hardball style tactics that the UAW was going to use, where Shawn Fain was at one point went into an office. So this was prior to the Kentucky truck assembly plant strike for Ford. Shawn Fain basically went to the offices of the high-level executives for Ford where they were negotiating and said, you need to agree to X, Y, and Z of our demands now, or we are taking, or we're going to go and increase our strike. And when they did not immediately agree to it, Shawn Fain looked at them and basically stated, you just lost Kentucky, and walked out. On his video calls that he would do on Facebook, where he would share updates with his members, there was a couple of times where he threw contract proposals from the big three into garbage cans live on stream in sort of a symbolic gesture. And so, as you can see, the big three were completely unprepared, and the UAW was able to use their lack of preparation to extreme advantage. They were able to gain major concessions from the big three when they did eventually reach an agreement. They reached a tentative agreement with Ford first, quickly followed by Stellantis. Then they increased their strike against GM, who then quickly again agreed to a tentative contract as well. All of the contracts did eventually get approved by membership, so that piece of it didn't have as much of an impact as it might have in previous years. But when we take a look at the contracts, they greatly increased the cost of labor to the big three to a significant extent. So there was an initial wage increase of 11% plus wage increases over the entire term of the contract that caused a total wage increase of 25%. There was a ratification bonus of about $5,000. There was a reinstatement of COLA, or cost of living adjustments, which meant that if inflation continues at the pace that it has been, their overall total pay could go up by actually 30% over the length of the contract. They won an additional holiday with the recognition of Juneteenth as a corporate holiday, and they also ended the two-tier pay system that had been put in place with the 07-08 recession. They completely eliminated that, and they were able to win the right to strike over plant closures, which helped cover their concerns when it came to the electric vehicle transition, where the UAW is concerned that the lower amount of labor required to construct an electric vehicle would lead to the big three closing plants and decreasing the amount of workers that they had on the payroll. So the UAW won the ability to strike over plant closures in the middle of the contract. Just if a plant closes, the UAW can strike if they find it objectionable. So when we're taking a look at this contract in the context of the rest of the market, the big three were and are incredibly concerned about their ability to absorb these costs. Like I had said earlier, the big three is already committed to spending billions of dollars on the transition to electric vehicles. And this new contract is going to increase the average labor cost of their, these are obviously estimates based on expert analysis, but it's going to potentially raise their labor costs from $65 an hour up to, by the end of the contract, $136 an hour per worker, which is a significant increase in their labor costs, given that prior to this contract, Tesla was only paying labor costs of about $45 an hour, and Toyota was only paying labor costs of about $55 an hour. Now, after the UAW finished these negotiations, other auto manufacturers that had plants that were non-union in the United States did provide pretty significant pay raises to their workers, not nearly to the extent of what the UAW was able to win, but the costs of labor for Toyota and Tesla and Volkswagen and any other company that has factories stateside, their costs will end up going will end up also increasing. However, the burden is not going to be nearly as significant as the burden is going to be on the big three. Additionally, when you take a look at the cost of the strike and the overall contract moving forward, it's going to end up costing the automakers billions of dollars, and the strike ended up already costing the automakers billions of dollars. However, the aftermath of the UAW strike and these talks and the contract are not the same for all of the big three. And they're not the same when you take a look at the UAW and their relationship with each of the big three. So Ford and GM are largely American companies. They largely sell vehicles stateside, and they tend to have slightly lower presence in foreign markets. Because of that, both Ford and GM are at extreme risk because of this UAW contract that they just signed and the significant costs that are going to be added to that, because majority of their vehicles are built and sold here in North America. So what we have started to see is both Ford and GM starting to roll back some of their EV transition plans and slow down the launch and rollout of new vehicles. You saw that with GM, where they put a pause on their Silverado EV launch and actually slowed down the transition of the factory that's going to be eventually building the Silverado EV. That's the launch of that has been delayed. And you see that with Ford as well, doing the same thing, with delaying some of their vehicles that they were originally going to launch as well, such as an EV version of the Ford Expedition and Ford Explorer. When you look at Stellantis, however, it's in a much more comfortable position. I wouldn't call it completely comfortable, as they do still have a significant American presence. However, the merging of Fiat Chrysler Automobiles with Peugeot in 2020 to form the company of Stellantis actually insulated them from some of these pressures, because only about half of their revenue and profits come from the American auto market. Peugeot is actually a very significant presence in Europe, and Stellantis has a very significant presence in the South American market, which allows them to still continue to generate strong revenue and strong profit margins despite costs going up in one of their regions. And Stellantis does still have the opportunity to shift their production to other more friendly regions when it comes to labor cost. You've seen this with the launch of the new Dodge nameplate, the Dodge Hornet, that took place in 2023. This new nameplate is being built in Italy. It's on the same platform as the Alfa Romeo Tonale. And so the simplification of the number of platforms that Stellantis is moving to, where they're going to build every vehicle on about 4 platforms, and their ability to shift production around globally because of their global presence, puts them in a much better position when it comes to absorbing the impact of this new UAW contract. In the beginning of the video, we did talk about what's going to need to happen to move forward for both the UAW and the big three to survive. And please note that this next final bit of the video is speculation. We do some of that here on the channel in order to provide you with our thoughts based on the analysis that we did. But in short, the UAW and the big three need to find a way to move forward from this and need to make an adjustment to the language that they're using in public, and are going to need to find a way to come together and combat the threats that come from Chinese automakers and regulation and the various other external challenges that they're all going to be facing. Throughout the 2023 UAW strike, you saw the automakers start to use public statements and announcements as a way for them to push their case to the American public, similar to the way that the union made their side of the negotiation much more transparent as well. One of the most prominent figures in this was Jim Farley of Ford. He came out and made several comments about the need for the UAW and Ford to come together and face the challenge of foreign automakers such as Toyota as a united front. Unfortunately, throughout most of the union's strike, these overtures were largely rejected by Shawn Fain and the union because of their collapsed relationship. You still continue to see Shawn Fain expressing those overtures now that we are past the strike, where you see him calling out Jim Farley for making false statements. You saw Jim Farley claim after the proposal had been ratified that if the contract had been in effect since 2019, Ford would have gone bankrupt. And Fain called him out in public and said that he was a liar. You see Shawn Fain, as he's begun attempting to unionize other auto manufacturer facilities throughout the United States, he has stated that the UAW fully intends to strike again when their contract expires in 2028, and he hopes everybody else joins in on the strike. We included that quote in the intro to this video. And so if things continue the way they are, and the relationship between the big three and the UAW does not improve, one of the big three or multiple of the big three has a high potential of failure. The transition to EVs is going to be a significant challenge that the automotive industry has to face. There are several industry insiders and experts that believe that mergers or failures are inevitable moving forward. One of the biggest proponents for that actually is Stellantis CEO Carlos Tavares and Chairman John Elkann. They are huge proponents of the concept that if you do not have greater consolidation within the auto industry through mergers, that there is going to be greater consolidation in the auto industry through corporate failure, corporate bankruptcy, and acquisitions. The UAW needs to understand this reality, is that electric vehicles are coming due to the external pressures of climate change and government regulations that come along with that. That transition has substantial cost, and automakers are not able to fully absorb those costs yet without some sort of give and take in every other aspect of their business. So, in conclusion, Common Sense Today would encourage both sides to work on repairing their relationship for the benefit of everybody. The big three need to realize the mistakes of the past, need to admit to the mistakes of the past, and need to appropriately adjust to the new reality of the UAW being a much more strong and steadfast partner, similar to the attitudes that the UAW and the strength that the UAW would have and exert in the 1970s. For their part, the UAW needs to understand that the auto industry is going through what could arguably be the most revolutionary period of its entire history since the invention of the automobile in the early 1900s. And because of that, the UAW is going to need to be flexible and creative when it comes to the proposals and the demands that they're placing upon the big three. They are not going to be able to just come in and issue large brazen demands of 46% wage increases and a 4-day work week when there are already significant multi-billion-dollar costs being imposed upon the big three from all of these other external factors. So with that, we'd like to thank you for tuning into this edition of Common Sense Today. We hope you enjoyed this video. We know it got pretty long, but there's a lot to talk about here. And to be honest, we could have spent many, many more hours and segments analyzing this issue. However, as always, we thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you again next time.